The clock on the kitchen wall read 1:17 in the morning, and Eleanor McAllister had not slept. She sat at the same table where she had sat every sleepless night for the past 3 weeks, the surface buried under a landslide of paper. Past due notices, certified letters with red ink at the top, a final demand from First Continental Bank of Amarillo, dated 18 days ago, paper-clipped to a summary judgment from their legal department that she had read so many times, the creases had gone white. The farm, 400 acres of Texas cotton land, her grandfather had broken with a mule and a prayer in 1931. Land her father had mortgaged once in 1962 and paid off in full by 1969. Land her husband Dale had walked every single morning of their 41 years together, talking to it like it was a living thing, calling it by its county road address like a name. Route 60 ground. Dale had been gone 3 years now. The cotton picker had been broken for 22 days, and the bank was coming at 10 in the morning. Eleanor pressed her palms flat against the table and looked out the kitchen window at the darkness. The fields were out there, invisible under the moonless sky, but she knew what they held. She could smell it even through the glass. 40 acres of mature cotton, white and heavy, the bolls blown open by the October wind, slowly losing fiber value with every passing day. Without the picker, none of it could be harvested. Without the harvest, she could not produce the $52,000 the bank required. She had called the John Deere dealer in Amarillo 3 weeks ago. The spindle drive assembly had seized up and taken the main drive shaft with it when it went. On a 1991 9970 cotton picker, that part had not been manufactured since 2003. The dealer had quoted her 6 to 8 weeks to source one, assuming they could find it at all. The repair cost alone would be $4,800, money she did not have. She had called her son Bobby 2 days after that. The number rang 7 times and went to voicemail. She had not called again. She thought about her grandfather, Marcus McAllister, who had come to the Texas Panhandle with nothing but an intent to stay, and had broken this specific ground with a mule he borrowed from a neighbor, and returned 3 weeks later, and a walking plow he had bought second-hand from a man in Amarillo. He had planted sorghum first, the crop that could survive on almost nothing, and he had lived in a 2-room house on this property for 7 years before he could afford to add a 3rd room. His wife Eleanor's grandmother had planted the cedar trees along the south fence line in 1934, trees that were still standing, big and dark and permanent, their roots as deep in this ground as anything could grow. 3 generations, 93 years. She thought about what it meant to lose something that had taken that long to build. She thought about it plainly, without melodrama, the way she approached most things. The loss would be real. It would be final. She was 74 years old, and she had no other land, and no savings to speak of, and a fixed income that covered the basics, and not much beyond them. If the bank took the farm tomorrow, she would need to find somewhere else to live. She had thought about this carefully and practically over the past 18 days, the way you think about any problem that needs to be solved. She had identified 2 options: her sister's house in Lubbock, where she had not spent more than a week at a time in 30 years, or a small rental apartment in town that she had seen advertised. Both were possible. Neither was what she wanted. What she wanted was this table, this window, this ground. But wanting was not the same as having, and Eleanor McAllister had known that long enough not to confuse the two. Eleanor was not a woman who called twice for things. She was 74 years old. She stood 5'4" in her boots. Her hair had gone completely white in the year after Dale died, and she had stopped coloring it. The hands resting on the table were the hands of a woman who had spent 50 years in the Texas sun, the knuckles large, the skin papery and cross-hatched with old work. She had a small scar on her left forearm from a baling wire accident in 1988. Her eyes were the pale, washed-out blue of a winter sky, and they missed nothing. She had already spoken to the bank's lead agent, a man named Warren Tisdale, 4 times. He was polite in the way that expensive lawyers are polite, with a politeness that is entirely structural and contains no warmth. He had explained her options twice. She had explained her situation twice in return. The conversation had not changed. The debt was $52,000. The maturity date was tomorrow. The collateral was the land. Those were the facts, and facts did not bend for 74-year-old widows any more than they bent for anyone else. She looked at the farm's accounts, which she kept in a green ledger Dale had started in 1991, and she had continued in her own hand after he died, the pages shifting from his writing to hers, at the entry dated October 17th, 3 years ago. She had kept the same format, the same column headers, the same method of notation, because changing the format would have felt like erasing him, and she was not ready for that. The ledger told the same story the bank letters told, except in her own handwriting, which somehow made it worse. There were the operating expenses, the fuel and the seed and the chemicals and the maintenance costs and the insurance. There were the crop receipts, smaller each year for the past 4 years, as the yield declined with the equipment and the labor shortage that comes when a farm is managed by a single aging woman. There were the loan payments made consistently until this year, when the combine harvester had failed, and the decision to continue making loan payments out of savings had exhausted the savings without making a dent in the principal. She had not made a mistake. She had done everything she knew how to do. The situation had simply been larger than the resources available to manage it, and that was not a failure of judgment or effort. It was the arithmetic of a farm that had been running on diminishing margins for 3 years because the person who had shared the management of it was gone. She knew all of this. She had known it for months. Knowing it did not make the stack of papers smaller. Eleanor reached over and clicked off the kitchen light. She sat in the darkness for a long moment, listening to the old farmhouse breathe around her. The creak of the roof joists, the low moan of the October wind, finding gaps in the window frames Dale had meant to caulk the autumn before he died. The distant sound of a semi-truck on the highway 1.5 miles north running toward Amarillo in the dark. Then she heard something else. It started low, a deep mechanical groan that climbed rapidly into a scream. She knew that sound. She had lived off Route 60 for 40 years, and she knew the difference between a truck engine and a motorcycle, and she knew the difference between a motorcycle running normally and one running at a speed that the road could not safely hold. The sound peaked. Then came the hideous shriek of brakes locking up the sound of rubber losing its argument with asphalt. Then the crash. Not a single impact, but a sequence, metal striking asphalt, metal striking wood, and then a second deeper impact as something very large and very heavy tumbled, end over end, into the drainage ditch that ran along the south edge of her property line, 30 yards off the shoulder of Route 60. Then silence. Eleanor was already moving. She did not stop for shoes. She pulled her work boots from beside the back door and shoved her feet in without tying the laces, grabbed the heavy flashlight off the counter, and went out through the back door at a pace that was not quite a run, but was as close to one as her hips would allow. The night air hit her like a wall cold, and carrying the smell of the season's last alfalfa from the fields to the north. She crossed the yard and pushed through the gap in the cedar fence, her flashlight beam bouncing across the dormant cotton rows, and she came out onto the slope of the drainage ditch, just as the first orange tongue of flame licked up from the wreckage below. The motorcycle was a massive thing, a custom-built American machine with a V-twin engine the size of a small car's block, now lying on its left side at the bottom of the ditch. The frame had crumpled against the concrete drainage culvert at the base of the slope, and fuel was leaking from the fractured tank in a dark, spreading pool that caught the flame and began to glow. The man underneath it was enormous. Eleanor slid down the ditch bank on her heels, catching herself on a fence post stake, and she got close enough to see him. He was face down, one arm pinned beneath the chassis, the other stretched out across the concrete. He wore heavy black denim and a leather vest, and even in the growing firelight, she could see the large patch across the back, a wolf's head rendered in silver and black, and beneath it, in an arc, Iron Wolves MC. Below that, a bottom rocker, Texas. The fire was not yet at the tank. but the tank was cracked, and the fuel was reaching the exhaust pipe, and Eleanor had grown up around enough farm machinery to know what happened next if she stood here measuring the situation instead of acting on it. She shone the flashlight along his leg. His right leg was under the rear frame of the motorcycle, the tire resting across his calf. The bike weighed at her best estimate somewhere between 500 and 600 pounds. She was a 74-year-old woman who had not lifted anything heavier than a 50-pound feed sack in the past 5 years. She looked around the ditch. There was a length of rebar half buried in the concrete slope, rusted 18 inches long, left over from a culvert repair job some years back. She worked it free with both hands and jammed it under the frame of the motorcycle at the lowest point she could reach, using the lip of the culvert as a fulcrum. Then she pushed down on the rebar with everything she had. The machine did not move. She repositioned her feet, bent her knees, the way Dale had taught her to lift heavy things when she was young, put her weight behind it, and pushed again. The frame groaned, shifted, lifted perhaps 2 inches. 2 inches was not enough, but it was a start. She repositioned again her boots, finding purchase on the damp concrete, and she drove herself downward with everything in her hips and her back and her arms, and the motorcycle lifted. Not far, not gracefully, but enough that his leg came free of the tire's weight, and she used her foot to push his boots sideways clear of the frame, and then she let the machine settle back and went around to his head and grabbed him by the collar of his vest. He was well over 200 pounds. She pulled anyway. She dragged him 4 feet, 6 feet, 8 feet up the slope of the ditch, her knees bleeding where they had hit the concrete, her palms burning from the friction of the rebar and from the heat radiating off the engine block when she had reached underneath it. She got him to the top of the bank, to the dry grass, and she dropped to her knees beside him and put 2 fingers to his neck. His pulse was there. Strong, actually. A big man's pulse. She rolled him carefully onto his back. His forehead was laid open above the left eyebrow, a clean cut that was bleeding freely down into his gray-streaked beard. His right leg looked intact, no compound fracture visible, though there would be deep bruising at minimum. He was breathing on his own steadily, if shallowly. The motorcycle's fuel tank went up behind her with a concussive crack that she felt more than heard a wave of heat rolling across her back as she bent over him. Burning debris scattered across the ditch. She did not flinch. "Hey!" She put her palm flat on his sternum. "Hey, wake up!" He did not wake up. Eleanor looked down the empty highway. No headlights. No sign of anyone. She looked at the burning wreck in the ditch, at the man bleeding on the grass in front of her, and she made a series of rapid, practical decisions. The silence after the explosion was total. Even the insects in the drainage ditch had gone quiet, as if the detonation had reset the world to zero, and everything was waiting to see what it would be next. Eleanor lay on the dry grass at the top of the bank, with the man beside her, both of them coated in dust, and the grit that an explosion sends outward in every direction, and she could feel her heartbeat in her burned palms and in her knees where they had hit the concrete. She did not allow herself to feel any of it yet. There was still work to do. She had learned this early growing up on a farm, that the body will cooperate with the task if you insist, and will only present its bill when the task is completed. Her father had taught her this by example, working through a broken finger in the middle of a harvest, because stopping was not an option, wrapping it himself in the evening when the day's work was done. Dale had operated the same way. Eleanor had inherited it, or absorbed it, or simply found that it was true, and had organized herself accordingly. The compress needed to stay in place. She pressed it firmly. The man's breathing was steady. That was the important thing. That was the fact she organized the next minutes around. She went back to the house. She called 911 and reported the accident, giving the mile marker and the county road number. The dispatcher told her emergency services would be there in approximately 22 minutes. Eleanor looked at the clock. It was 1:39 in the morning. She went back outside with a clean dish towel and the first aid kit Dale had kept stocked in the hall closet. She had added to it over the years with the additions that farm life requires: butterfly closures, a proper compression bandage, medical tape, a pair of trauma shears. She folded the dish towel into a compress and pressed it firmly against the wound on his forehead, taping it in place. She elevated his right leg on a folded canvas tarp she pulled from the shed. She sat beside him in the cold dark and kept the compress in place with her hand and waited. His eyes opened at 1:52 in the morning. They were dark brown, almost black in the firelight, and they came open fast, the way the eyes of men who have spent time in dangerous situations come open immediately alert, immediately taking inventory. He looked at the burning ditch. He looked at the sky. He looked at Eleanor. She could see him processing it, the compress on his head, the woman's hand holding it, the woman's age, the absence of the motorcycle. "Your bike is gone," she said. "Fire got it. Your leg is going to hurt for a while, but I don't think anything broke. EMTs are about 20 minutes out." He looked at her for a long moment. His voice, when it came, was deep and rough, abraded by years of road noise and open-air riding and whatever else had worn it into that particular texture. "You pull me out." "I did." "By yourself." There wasn't anyone else around. He looked at her hands. Her palms were red, the skin at the base of each thumb already blistering where it had contacted the hot metal of the frame. He looked at the dried blood on her knees from where she had gone down on the concrete. "You're bleeding," he said. "So are you." She pressed the compress a fraction firmer. "Lie still. You may have a concussion." He lay still. Not because she told him to. Eleanor could see that. He lay still because he was taking stock of himself, cataloging damage the way a man does when he has been in enough accidents to know the protocol. "Raymond Holden," he said after a moment. "Cage. Eleanor McAllister, don't try to sit up." He didn't. He looked at the sky, which was beginning to show the faintest indigo at the eastern edge, the pre-dawn color that comes before any actual light. "How'd you get the bike up?" "Rebar and a fulcrum. 8th grade physics." Something shifted in his expression. It might have been the beginning of a smile suppressed before it fully formed. 8th grade physics. "The lever is the oldest tool there is," Eleanor said. "My husband used to say that." The EMTs arrived at 2062 paramedics named Torres and Webb, who were professional and efficient, and asked Eleanor several questions she answered with the accuracy of a woman who had been present and paying attention. They assessed Cage, confirmed the absence of spinal injury, treated the head laceration with 6 sutures, and confirmed the right leg bruising was soft tissue only. They wanted to transport him to the hospital in Amarillo. He refused. He refused in a tone that made Torres and Webb look at each other and make a decision to stop pushing the point. He signed the refusal form. He sat up slowly and looked at Eleanor. "I can't leave you at the side of the road," she said before he could speak. "I wasn't going to ask you to." She drove him back to the farmhouse in her truck, the old F25, that Dale had bought in 2009, and Eleanor had maintained with the same straightforward care she applied to everything. Cage sat in the passenger seat with his head back against the window and his eyes open, watching the dark fields slide past. "Cotton," he said. "Yes, lot of it still standing." Eleanor said nothing. She set him up in the guest room that had been Bobby's room, a fact she did not mention. She put clean towels on the chair and a glass of water on the nightstand and told him there was aspirin in the medicine cabinet across the hall. "Thank you," he said. "You're welcome. Sleep if you can." She went back to the kitchen table. She sat down in front of the stack of papers. The sky outside was going from black to indigo to gray, the slow, unstoppable progression of morning in the Texas Panhandle. At 7:15, she heard him moving in the hall. He appeared in the kitchen doorway. He was a large man, she confirmed again in the morning light. 6'2" at minimum, broad through the shoulders, his leather vest over a clean black t-shirt that he had apparently found in his saddlebag because she had not provided it. He had washed his face. The white bandage on his forehead was clean. His dark hair was shot through with gray at the temples. He had, she estimated, perhaps 15 years on her, which put him somewhere in his late 50s. The patches on his vest were visible in the kitchen light. Iron Wolves MC in a curve above the wolf's head, Texas in a bottom rocker, and on the left breast a small patch that read SGT at arms. He looked at the kitchen table, at the papers, at Eleanor sitting at the center of it. He looked for a long time. Then he went to the coffee pot, poured himself a cup without asking, pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. Eleanor looked at him. "Tell me," he said. She looked at him for a moment. She was not accustomed to being told by strangers to tell them things. She was 74 years old, and she had lived alone for 3 years, and she had not talked about the debt and the bank and the machine with anyone in weeks because there was no one left to talk to about it. She told him. Not everything. Not the part about Bobby, but the farm, the cotton picker, the bank, the timeline. She said it plainly without requesting sympathy, the way she gave information to contractors and vets and grain buyers as a set of facts to be understood and acted upon. Cage listened without interrupting. When she finished, he picked up the bank's final demand notice from the top of the stack and read it. He set it down. He looked at the demand figure. What time do they come? 10 in the morning. He looked at the clock on the kitchen wall. It was 7:38. He picked up the phone from beside the coffee pot. "That's mine," Eleanor said. "I know." He looked at her. "May I?" She nodded. He dialed a number from memory. It rang twice and was answered. Eleanor could hear the voice on the other end, rough and half awake. "Reed," Cage said. "Amarillo. The cotton farm on Route 60 south of town. Get here." A pause. "Because a woman saved my life last night, and the bank is coming for her farm at 10 o'clock this morning." A shorter pause. "Yes. Now." He put the phone down. Eleanor looked at him. "Who is Reed?" she said. "President of my chapter." Eleanor considered this. "How many people are in your chapter?" Cage looked at the window. Outside, the October sun was beginning to clear the horizon, throwing long gold light across the dormant cotton fields. He appeared to be doing arithmetic. "Enough," he said. At 8:20, Eleanor felt the vibration before she heard the sound. She had lived on this land long enough to know every variation of road noise on Route 60. She knew the difference between a pickup and a semi, between a grain truck and a livestock trailer, between one motorcycle and several. This was not several. This was a number that produced a physical sensation in the floorboards of the house, a low, sustained trembling, like a tremor that doesn't quite become an earthquake. She came out onto the front porch. The convoy came over the slight rise on Route 60 in a tight formation, riding 2 by 2, the kind of disciplined column that spoke of men who had ridden together long enough that it had become second nature. The chrome caught the morning sun and threw it back in bright fragments. The sound built until it was everywhere in the chest and in the teeth, a wall of displacement and exhaust that rolled across the cotton fields and echoed off the barn. Eleanor counted as they turned onto her driveway. She stopped counting at 47. She had time in the 45 seconds before the convoy reached the driveway to observe details she might have missed if she had been frightened or hurrying. The formation was not random. It had structured 2 lead riders at the point, a wider V behind them, then the main body in disciplined pairs with a rear element bringing up the end. It was the kind of formation that spoke of men who had ridden together long enough that the positions were automatic, that each rider knew without discussion where he belonged and pulled there without prompting. She noticed that none of them were looking at her exactly, even though they all knew where the farmhouse was and where she would be standing. They were looking at the property, at the fields, at the barn, at the broken machine. They were doing the same thing she would do if she arrived somewhere unfamiliar and needed to understand it quickly. They were reading the land. That told her something. She did not know yet what it told her, but she filed it. They filled the yard and the drive and the field road alongside the barn, parking with the practiced economy of men who have parked motorcycles together many times. The engines cut out one by one until the last one died, and the silence that followed was enormous and strange, filled only with the tick of cooling metal and the distant cry of a hawk working the west field. The man who got off the bike at the front of the formation was not Cage. He was perhaps 50, Eleanor estimated, with a clean-shaved head and a jaw that looked like it had been constructed for the specific purpose of not yielding ground. He wore his iron wolves vest over a flannel shirt with the sleeves cut off, and on his left breast, the same small rectangular patch, President. He walked toward the porch. Two men fell in behind him without being asked. Eleanor stood at the top of the porch steps and waited. She did not go inside. She did not pick up the phone. She stood where she was and looked at the man coming toward her across the yard, past the 47 motorcycles and the 47 men who had ridden them, and she kept her hands still at her sides. He stopped at the bottom of the steps. He looked at her for a moment, then up at the farmhouse, assessing it with the same unhurried thoroughness with which a man looks at anything he is trying to understand. The peeling paint on the porch rail, the patch on the roof over the bathroom that Dale had put up in 2016, and that Eleanor had been intending to replace with something more permanent. The broken combine harvester sitting beside the barn door, its spindle heads retracted and rusting. He looked back at Eleanor. Reed Briggs was not what she had expected, and she was not sure what she had expected. In the seconds between his dismounting and his walking toward her, she had formed the usual preliminary estimate that a person forms when someone unknown approaches age-bearing intent. She placed him at 50, maybe 52. He moved without urgency, but without hesitation, the particular combination of those two things that indicates a man who has made a lot of decisions quickly and has learned not to waste motion. His hands were at his sides and open, which she noted without quite noting it consciously, the way you note that a door is unlocked without stopping to think about what that means. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at her, and she had the impression of someone who was accustomed to being looked at, who had been in the position of arriving somewhere and being observed and assessed too many times to feel anything about it now, except a functional patience. "Reed Briggs," he said. "I run the Texas Charter." "Eleanor McAllister," she said. "I run this farm." Something in his expression acknowledged this. "Cage called." "I know. I was in the kitchen." Reed Briggs looked over his shoulder at the standing cotton fields, 40 acres of opened bowls white against the brown of the stalks, brilliant in the morning sun. He turned back. "He told me what you did. I did what needed doing." "Most people see that patch," he said, and he tapped the Iron Wolves emblem on his chest. "They don't do what needs doing. They get in their house and they lock the door." Eleanor said nothing. It was not a question. Reed looked at the broken cotton picker again. He looked at it for a long time. "Tell me about the machine," he said. She told him. The spindle drive assembly, the John Deere 9970, the part that hadn't been manufactured since 2003, the timeline. When she was done, Reed turned to the man on his right, a lean, quiet individual with a long gray braid down his back and the patch vice press on his chest. "Get me Cage," Reed said. Cage appeared from around the side of the porch, moving carefully, but on his own power, the white bandage vivid against the dark of his face. Reed looked at him, and his expression did something complicated and brief. "She tell you the part number?" Reed asked Cage. "Not yet." Cage looked at Eleanor. Eleanor went inside and came back with the John Deere parts manual open to the page she had bookmarked 3 weeks ago. She handed it to Reed. Reed studied the page. He handed it to the man with the braid. The man took a photograph of it with his phone. Reed looked at the 47 men standing in the yard and the drive. "All right," he said. His voice was not loud, but it carried. "This farm has 400 acres of cotton that needs to come in before 10 o'clock this morning. We have got just over 2 hours. There is a broken machine that is the key to making that possible or not possible. We find the part, we fix the machine. In the meantime, we work by hand." He paused. A brief, flat pause. "You know what's at stake. Let's move." They moved. Eleanor stood on the porch and watched 47 men who spent their lives doing things that the law disapproved of begin to work her fields with the focused intensity of people paying a debt they had decided to honor. Some of them had clearly never touched a cotton plant in their lives. She could see them learning the action in real time, watching the men beside them adjusting their grip. But none of them stopped, and none of them asked to be shown twice. Reed came back up onto the porch and stood beside her. "Do you have any hand equipment?" he said. "Sacks, tarps, anything to collect with." "In the barn, left side of the rear wall." He nodded and turned to relay this. "Mr. Briggs." He turned back. Eleanor looked at him steadily. "I want you to understand something. I did not pull your man out of that ditch for any reason other than that he was there and needed pulling out. I didn't do it for a reward. I don't want anyone to think this is a transaction." Reed Briggs looked at her for a long moment. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice had something in it that had not been there a moment before. Neither did we. He went down the steps and into the yard, and Eleanor watched him go. Then she turned and looked at the fields, at the white cotton blazing in the morning light, at the 47 men spreading through the rows, and at the broken machine sitting beside her barn that was either going to save the farm or sit there and watch it be taken away. She went inside to put more coffee on. At 8:55, Cage appeared in the kitchen doorway. "I've been on the phone," he said. "There's a woman named Dottie Dixon in Hereford, 40 miles west. Her husband was a John Deere mechanic for 30 years. He died 2 years back. She kept everything in his shop." Eleanor turned from the coffee pot. "Does she have the part?" "I don't know, but her husband worked on cotton pickers his entire career. If anyone has a 9970 spindle drive assembly sitting in a barn in the Texas Panhandle, it's going to be in her barn." Eleanor looked at the clock. 8:57. The bank was due at 10. "That's 80 miles round trip," she said, "in a little over an hour." Cage looked at her with the steady brown eyes of a man who had spent a long time on fast machines on open roads. "I know 2 men in that yard who can do it in 40 minutes, he said. Eleanor set down the coffee pot. "Make the call," she said. Cage went out the back door. Eleanor heard him calling names across the yard, the snap of his voice carrying the same authority she had heard Reed Briggs use the tone of men who had spent years in organizations where a direct order was the most efficient form of communication available. She heard 2 engines fire up, then 2 more louder than the rest. Then the sound of rubber finding traction on the hard pan of the drive rising fast, hitting Route 60 at a speed that was clearly not within any posted limit, and then diminishing eastward until the panhandle wind took it, and there was nothing left but the creak of the windmill and the voices of men in the cotton fields. Eleanor stood at the kitchen window and watched the cotton bolls in the nearest row move with the wind. The farm had been in her family for 93 years. She had 400 acres and an hour and 3 minutes. She went outside to help pick cotton. Reed Briggs saw her come around the side of the house and into the fields with a canvas sack over one shoulder, and she could see him begin to say something about it. She looked at him with an expression that Dale had described once in a rare moment of spousal frankness as the one that stops arguments before they start. Reed closed his mouth. Eleanor McAllister went to work on her own land. She worked the rows she knew best, the east section nearest the highway, where the soil was sandier and the bolls opened earliest, moving with the particular economy of a woman who had done this her entire life. Her hands still stung from the burns of the night before, but she had wrapped them in clean gauze and she could use them well enough. She could pick faster than half the men working the rows around her, and she moved through them methodically, not stopping, not resting, not looking at the clock. But she looked at the barn. The machine sat there, still, silent. The morning wore on. At 9:14, a black SUV turned off Route 60 onto her drive. Eleanor straightened up. She knew the vehicle. She had seen it twice before in the parking lot of the First Continental Bank in downtown Amarillo, both times when she had gone in to speak with Warren Tisdale. It was 46 minutes before the deadline. Reed was already walking toward the house from the western field. He had been watching the road. The SUV stopped in the yard. A second one pulled in behind it. Warren Tisdale got out of the first one wearing a charcoal gray suit that was going to need dry cleaning after 5 minutes in this yard. He had a leather portfolio under his arm. He had a second man with him in an identical suit. He looked at the motorcycles. He looked at the men in the fields. He looked at the farmhouse. He was still looking when Reed Briggs walked up and stood in front of him. Tisdale collected himself. "I need to speak to Mrs. McAllister." She's working. I beg your pardon. She's in the fields. She's working. You'll wait. Tisdale looked at Reed Briggs with the expression of a man who is accustomed to institutional authority and has just discovered that it carries less weight in certain contexts than in others. He looked at the 45 men who had paused in the fields to watch him. Mr. Briggs. Mr. Briggs, I have a court-authorized foreclosure order. The debt matures at 10 o'clock this morning. I am well within my rights to— It is 9:17, Reed said. His voice was entirely reasonable. The deadline is 10. You are here 43 minutes early. Mrs. McAllister does not owe you anything until 10 o'clock. You are on private property without an invitation, which makes you a trespasser, and in Texas, that carries its own set of implications. Reed smiled briefly. You want to wait in your truck, or you want to stand out here in the sun? Tisdale looked at the second man in the suit, who looked at the 45 bikers who were all looking at him, and who said nothing. Tisdale went back to the SUV. Eleanor had watched the exchange from the edge of the field. She pulled off her work gloves, tucked them in her back pocket, and walked across the yard to where Reed was standing. He'll stay, Reed said. He's got nowhere to go. I know. Eleanor looked at the clock above the barn door, a large outdoor clock Dale had installed in 2004 because he hated squinting at his watch. 9:19. 41 minutes. She looked at the cotton picker. She looked at the road west. No dust cloud, no sound of approaching engines. She picked up her gloves and went back to the field. At 9:41, with 19 minutes remaining, and the banker's SUV still parked in her yard, Eleanor McAllister was working the last row of the east section when she became aware of a sound on the western horizon. 2 engines, coming fast, coming very fast. She stood up. The sound grew from a distant note to a roar to a presence, and then 2 motorcycles flew over the rise on Route 60, going in excess of 100 miles an hour, and hit her driveway at a speed that threw rooster tails of caliche gravel 20 feet into the air. They slid to a stop in the yard. The rider of the first bike swung off before the machine had fully stopped moving, his face streaked with road grime and his jacket plastered flat against his chest from the wind. He reached into his saddlebag with both hands. He pulled out a heavy mechanical component, steel and brass caked with old grease, a spindle drive assembly from a 1991 John Deere 9970 cotton picker. He held it up. The yard went quiet. Then someone in the field made a sound and someone else answered it, and then it was not quiet at all. Eleanor stood at the edge of the field with both hands at her sides and looked at the part. She looked at the barn. She looked at the clock above the barn door. 9:43. 17 minutes. She looked at Reed Briggs. Reed looked at her. I need a mechanic, Eleanor said. So do I, Reed said. Cage was already moving toward them from the side of the house, and he had a look on his face that Eleanor would later think about the look of a man who has been on the phone and has arranged something he is not entirely sure was the right arrangement to make. There's something else, Cage said. Eleanor waited. I called Dottie Dixon, he said, to tell her we were coming. She already knew what we needed the part for. Her husband worked this farm in 1998, did the cotton picker's first major service. She knew your husband. Eleanor's expression did not change, but something moved in the pale blue of her eyes. Anne, she said. She wouldn't let Slade and Duke take the part without her. Eleanor looked at the road. Where is she? Eleanor said. Coming, Cage said. She's 71. She drives slower than my guys. The sound of a truck engine came over the rise on Route 60. It was an old Ford Ranger, faded red, moving at a sensible speed that was nothing like the speed of the 2 motorcycles that had preceded it. It turned into the drive and came carefully down the caliche, and the woman who got out of it was 71 years old, short and round-shouldered, with gray hair, cut practical and close to her head, and work pants and a flannel shirt and boots that had seen as many years of service as Eleanor's own. She walked across the yard and she looked at Eleanor McAllister. I'm Dottie Dixon, she said. I know who you are, Eleanor said. George Dixon worked my picker in '98. Dottie Dixon looked at Eleanor's hands, at the bandaging, at the fields behind her, at the partially harvested rows, at the broken machine in the barn door. Show me the machine, Dottie said. They went in together, Eleanor and Dottie Dixon, and the 47 iron wolves watched them go. The inside of the barn smelled of oil and old wood, and the particular dry metal smell of machinery that has been sitting idle too long. The cotton picker stood at the center of the space, enormous and inert. Its green paint faded to a color that was almost gray at the edges, its spindle heads retracted like the fingers of a closed hand. Eleanor had looked at this machine every day for 3 weeks each time, with the same flat feeling in her stomach that comes from something being wrong that you cannot fix. Dottie Dixon walked around it with her hands behind her back, the way Eleanor had watched Dale walk around sick cattle, not touching, yet just looking. She crouched down beside the left side of the drivetrain housing. She looked at the seized assembly. She reached out and put her hand on the metal and pressed, feeling the resistance. "George would have had this out in 2 hours," she said. But George had all his tools and a lift and coffee. She stood up and looked at Eleanor. "How much time?" 16 minutes. Dottie looked at the part in Slade's hands. She looked at the machine. She did the calculation that Eleanor could see her doing, the internal arithmetic of a woman who had spent decades learning a craft at the shoulder of a man who loved it. Dottie Dixon moved through the barn the way Eleanor had watched Dale move through it, with the unhurried thoroughness of someone who is going to understand a thing completely before they touch it. She looked at the machine from 4 different angles. She crouched down and looked at the undercarriage. She looked at the drive housing for a long time without touching it, her hands still in her pockets, her eyes doing the work. Eleanor watched her and thought about the weight of 30 years of watching. Dottie had stood beside George Dixon in shops and barns across the Panhandle for 3 decades, and she had been paying attention. Not because she intended to become a mechanic, but because she had loved her husband and was interested in what he was interested in. An interest sustained over 30 years accumulates into something that looks a great deal like expertise. George would be here too, Eleanor thought. In whatever way the people we have loved and lost are present in the knowledge they left behind. He would be in the careful way Dottie's hands went to those 3 specific points on the housing. In the fraction of a second she paused before tightening each bolt to make sure she had it right. That was not a small thing. "I need a 3/4-inch impact driver, a number 8 Allen wrench penetrating oil, and somebody large enough to hold the housing steady when I tell them to hold it. All of it's on the pegboard," Eleanor said, pointing to the south wall. Dale kept a full set. Dottie went to the pegboard. Cage said, "I'll hold whatever needs holding." They went to work. Eleanor stood back. She understood the decision. She was not a mechanic. Her hands were damaged, and she would be more hindrance than help in this specific task. Standing back was the right thing to do. She stood back and watched Dottie Dixon work, and she did what she had been doing all night, which was to keep her mind steady and her breathing even, and to not look at the clock more than she could help. She looked at the clock. 9:47. She went to the barn door and looked out. The yards was as it had been, the motorcycles, the men, the 2 black SUVs with their occupants inside. The cotton in the fields. The wide, flat Panhandle sky. She heard the impact driver begin its rapid, percussive work behind her. At 9:53 she heard Dottie say, "Hold it, don't let it turn," and Cage answered, "Held." At 9:57 she heard the sound of the new assembly going in the muffled mechanical language of parts finding their seating. At 9:59, Dottie Dixon stood up from beside the machine and looked at Cage and at Eleanor and at the clock on the barn wall. "Start it," Dottie said. Eleanor walked to the cab of the cotton picker. She climbed the steps, her knees protesting, and sat in the seat where she had sat hundreds of times, where Dale had sat thousands of times before her. The seat was cold. The dash was dusty. The key was in the ignition where she had left it 3 weeks ago after the machine had seized and gone silent. She put her hand on the key. "Lord," she said quietly to the empty cab, "I've been doing this by myself for 3 years. I could use a hand." She turned the key. The starter engaged. The big diesel engine turned over once, twice, 3 times. A sound like something deep in the machine resisting. Then a cough. Then the engine found its compression and came to life with a vibration that she felt through the seat and through the steering wheel and through the floor of the cab, a sound she had heard hundreds of mornings, a sound that was as fundamental to this farm as the hawk's cry and the creak of the windmill and the wind moving through the cotton rows. The spindleheads came out. Eleanor looked through the cab window. She saw Dottie Dixon standing in the barn with her hands at her sides, watching the machine, and the expression on the older woman's face was the expression of a person watching something they were not sure was going to happen actually happen. Eleanor looked at the clock on the barn wall. 10:01. She looked at the yard. Warren Tisdale had gotten out of his SUV. He was walking toward the barn. Reed Briggs was already moving to intercept him. Eleanor climbed down from the cab and walked out of the barn into the morning sun, and Warren Tisdale stopped when he saw her coming. He had his portfolio open. He had the foreclosure order in his hand. His expression was the expression of a man who has waited longer than he wanted to and who has decided that waiting is over. "Mrs. McAllister," he said, "it is 10:01. I'm here to serve. Mr. Tisdale." Eleanor stopped 3 feet from him. She kept her voice even. "You came onto my property at 9:17 this morning. The foreclosure document you are holding gives you the right to serve those papers at 10 o'clock. Not before. You were here 43 minutes early." She looked at him steadily. "That is a violation of the covenant agreement in Section 7, Paragraph B of my loan documents. I have the original loan documents in my house. I can get them if you'd like to compare language." Tisdale stared at her. He looked at the papers in his hand. He looked at Reed Briggs standing at Eleanor's shoulder. He looked at the machine that was idling behind them in the barn, its engine running, its spindle heads extended alive. "The early arrival was simply—" "I know what it was," Eleanor said. "And I know what it means legally. Sheriff Lena Cross is a personal friend of mine. She has been a personal friend of mine for 30 years. I called her at 7:30 this morning before your office opened, and I told her you were coming. She knows the timeline." Eleanor let a beat pass. "She'll be here shortly. Do you want to discuss the early arrival with her, or would you rather give me until 11 o'clock, which is what Section 7, Paragraph B entitles me to when a creditor arrives prior to the agreed service window?" The yard was completely silent. Warren Tisdale was a man who had done this job for 17 years. He had served a great many foreclosure orders. He had dealt with upset farmers and desperate homeowners, and occasionally with people who became hostile in ways that required a call to law enforcement. He had not, in 17 years, dealt with a 74-year-old woman standing in a yard full of motorcycle club members who was quoting section and paragraph numbers at him from memory. He looked at the papers. He looked at Eleanor. 11 o'clock, he said finally. It came out flat and unhappy. "Thank you," Eleanor said. She turned and walked back to the barn. She did not look at Reed Briggs. She did not look at the 47 men who had watched the exchange from the field. She went to the cotton picker, climbed back into the cab, and put the machine in gear. Behind her, as she drove out of the barn into the morning light, she heard a sound from the yard that she had not expected. Not a cheer exactly, something quieter than that, and in some ways more powerful. The sound of 47 people who have just watched something they did not anticipate. Eleanor drove into the cotton rows. The machine moved into the field, and the spindles engaged, and the first opened bowls came in through the header with the familiar hiss and thump that she had heard since she was a small girl, standing on the edge of the field, watching her grandfather work. The header swallowed the crop, and the separation began in the guts of the machine, and the clean cotton fiber began to move up into the collection chamber. Reed Briggs appeared on the running board of the cab. He had pulled himself up alongside the slow-moving machine with the ease of a man who was comfortable with moving machinery. "What do you need?" he said. "2 trucks running to the gin at Fraley's," Eleanor said, keeping her eyes on the rows. "It's 8 miles north on Route 60. Tell them to move fast. We have until 11. Reed dropped off the running board and disappeared. Eleanor drove. The sun was climbing now, burning off the last of the morning cool, and the panhandle wind had come up from the southwest, carrying the smell of dry grass and caliche dust. The cotton came in steady, and even the machine moving at its operational pace, and Eleanor felt the vibration of it through the seat and through the wheel, and she thought about Dale, who had sat in this same seat the first autumn after they bought the machine 22 years old and grinning like he'd just been given the best present of his life. 400 acres, 1 hour and 53 minutes. She drove. The cotton picker moved through the first row at 4 miles an hour, and Eleanor let it find its rhythm. She had driven this machine hundreds of times in every kind of weather and light the Texas panhandle could produce, through storms and heat waves and the occasional early frost that came without warning and turned the opened bowls brittle and black at the edges. She knew every vibration and every sound it made when it was working correctly, and she could hear now, under the engine note and the hiss of the crop coming through the header, a slight unevenness in the spindle drive that told her Dottie's repair was functional but not perfect. Not that it mattered. It did not need to be perfect. It only needed to last until 11 o'clock. Through the cab window, she could see the field road to the north, where a pickup truck had appeared and was backing toward the collection bin at the rear of the machine. One of the Iron Wolves had found the grain truck in her equipment barn. She hadn't asked who. It had simply appeared, as things had been simply appearing since 8:20 that morning. 2 more vehicles materialized on the field road. She could see them from the cab, an aging flatbed with wooden sideboards and a utility trailer pulled by a pickup she didn't recognize. Men were loading canvas collection sacks onto both of them. She had those sacks in the barn, 24 of them bought years ago for a hand-picking situation that had never materialized. They were being used now. The southern quarter of the east field went steadily into the collection chamber. Eleanor watched the yield counter on the dash. Dale had installed the aftermarket yield monitor in 2014, and it was still working, still telling her what she needed to know: pounds per acre moisture content, total throughput. The first few rows came in at good weights. The late-season dry spell had concentrated the sugars, and the fiber was dense. That was a blessing she hadn't counted on. She came to the end of the first section and turned the machine. A man was waiting at the end of the row. He was one of the younger Iron Wolves, perhaps 30, lean and dark-eyed, with road calluses on his hands. He held up both palms in a question: "Where do you need me?" Eleanor pointed at the rows to her left, the denser block where the crop was tallest. He nodded and went in with a hand sack. She drove. The cotton picker moved through the second row, and Eleanor adjusted the throttle slightly, the small correction of someone who knows a machine's preferences. There was a vibration in the header that she did not like, a slight rhythmic knock that was probably nothing, probably just the echo of the emergency repair translating through the chassis. But she listened to it, the way she listened to all of the machine's sounds, giving it full attention, tracking whether it stayed constant or changed. It stayed constant. She filed it under acceptable and drove on. The rows went by. She was aware of the men working at the edges of her vision, the steady rotation of the relay team, the sound of the truck engines coming and going on the field road. Reed had organized them with a speed and thoroughness that she respected professionally. She did not know what his life looked like on the ordinary days, what those men did, and how they lived. She knew what she could observe, that when there was a task, he had a plan for it inside of 5 minutes, that the plan made sense, and that the men carried it out without the need for explanation or repetition. She had worked with a lot of contractors over the years. Most of them were nowhere near as efficient as what she was watching now. The sun climbed. The heat built. The October panhandle morning was past its cool and moving into its full working temperature, the kind of heat that arrives slowly and then is simply present the way it has been present on this ground every October for as long as anyone has been here to feel it. Eleanor drove. Reed Briggs had organized the 47 into a system that Eleanor would think about later, when she had time to think about anything other than the task in front of her. He had divided them into 3 working groups: drivers for the collection vehicles, hand pickers for the rows the machine couldn't reach efficiently at the edges and the corners, and a relay team whose job was to run the loaded sacks to the collection bin at the rear of the picker in continuous rotation, so the machine never had to stop. It was not the most elegant logistics she had ever seen, but it was fast and it never stopped moving. At 10:22, Eleanor brought the full collection chamber alongside the grain truck, and the transfer began. She watched the bin empty, and she felt for the first time that morning something other than the tightly managed fear she had been carrying since the bank letter arrived 18 days ago. Not hope exactly, something smaller and more cautious than hope. The recognition that a thing which had seemed impossible was not as of this moment impossible. She turned the machine back into the field. Warren Tisdale's SUVs were still in her drive. She had been aware of them the entire time, the way you are aware of weather on the horizon. He had not come back out of the vehicle since their exchange at the barn. She had not seen his face in the windshield. Reed had posted 2 of his men near the driveway entrance in a gesture that was less a formal barrier and more a statement about the social physics of the situation. At 10:31, the first grain truck left for the cotton gin at Fraley's. She watched it pull out of the drive and turn north on Route 60, loaded with the first collection, and she did the rough arithmetic in her head. 8 miles to Fraley's, 8 miles back, assuming the gin crew moved quickly. The return trip would have cash vouchers, the same system Dale had used for 20 years, the same gin manager, the same handshake arrangement. She drove the south block. At 10:38, she heard the sound of another vehicle on Route 60. She looked north through the cab window. A county sheriff's cruiser was pulling into the drive. It parked behind the second SUV, and the woman who got out of it was someone Eleanor had known for 3 decades. Sheriff Lena Cross, who had been a deputy when Eleanor had met her and had run unopposed for the past 4 election cycles. Lena was 62 and built square and sturdy, with close-cropped iron-gray hair and the particular kind of unhurried authority that comes from long practice. Lena looked at the motorcycles. She looked at the fields. She looked at the grain truck departing up Route 60. Then she walked to Warren Tisdale's SUV and knocked on the window. Eleanor could not hear the conversation, but she could see it, and the body language was legible from 100 yards away. Tisdale had his portfolio out. Lena had her hands in her jacket pockets, the posture of someone who is not in a hurry and is not particularly impressed. After several minutes, Lena turned away from the SUV and walked toward the barn. Reed Briggs met her at the barn door. Eleanor turned the machine at the end of the row and began the south pass. She was watching everything. The yard, the fields, the gin truck that was coming back down Route 60, the men in the rows, the yield counter on the dash, the clock above the barn door. She was holding all of it simultaneously, the way she had held the farm together for 3 years alone, by watching everything at once and trusting nothing to chance. At 10:44, the gin truck returned with the first vouchers. A man Eleanor didn't know, heavy-set and tattooed, ran the vouchers to Reed at the barn. Reed looked at the numbers. Eleanor could read his expression from the cab, even at this distance, not quite enough, but not hopeless either. She drove faster. At 10:51, she heard a sound from the northern edge of the field. She looked and saw 3 more iron wolves who had moved beyond the field road and were working the far corner by hand, the corner the machine couldn't reach efficiently without making an extra pass that would cost time. They were working at speed, their collection sacks full, and they moved with the same methodical intensity that had characterized everything she had seen from these men since 8:20. She thought, these are men who know how to work toward a deadline. She thought about what kind of life produces that. She had grown up watching men work this land, and she had worked it herself for most of her adult life, and she thought she understood labor. But there was something in what she was watching now that was different from the ordinary varieties of it. The ordinary variety of hard work, the kind done by men for wages or obligation, had its own rhythm and its own character. It was competent, it was sustained, but it moved at the pace that work moves at when the primary motivation is completion. You did what was required, and when it was done, you stopped. What she was watching in the rows in front of her had a different energy. It had the quality of work done for a reason that the workers have decided is worth more than the effort. She had seen this before in the years when there was a drought and the neighbors came to help trading labor the old way, because everyone understood that the farm that survived the drought could help the farm that didn't next time. She had seen it in Dale every year at the end of the season, when the last of the crop came in and the sense of completion produced something beyond tiredness, something that looked like satisfaction but was deeper than that. What she was seeing in those rows was men working for someone they had decided deserved it. That was its own category. That was the thing she was watching. She drove. The yield counter climbed. She turned the machine into the last major block. The yield counter was reading well. The fiber was dense and the moisture was low, which was good for weight and good for price. The gin at Fraley's would grade it out at a decent number. She did the arithmetic again, the arithmetic she had been doing and revising all morning as new information came in. The debt was $52,000. The interest and fees as of today's date brought the total to approximately $52,800. She needed to clear that number. The question was whether 400 acres of cotton hand-stripped and machine-harvested in 2 hours under emergency conditions was going to hit that number. She drove. At 10:58, the second gin truck left. At 11:02, something happened that she felt before she heard it. A change in the engine note of the cotton picker. Subtle. A variation in the spindle drive frequency that she had been half expecting since the moment Dottie said the repair was functional, but had not said it was permanent. Eleanor's hands tightened on the wheel and she held very still and listened, and the note steadied. She breathed. The note changed again. She cut the throttle and brought the machine to a stop. The engine was still running, but the spindle drive was stuttering. She could feel it in the vibration of the floor. The repair had been made under emergency conditions with a second-hand part and penetrating oil and 18 minutes and the expertise of a 71-year-old woman who had learned from her husband. It had held for an hour and 2 minutes. Now it was telling her something. She climbed down from the cab. Reed was across the field in perhaps 30 seconds. He could read what the stopped machine meant. What's wrong? Drive stuttering. It's going to lock up again if I push it. Reed looked at the field, at the portion remaining, at the clock. At that moment, Dottie Dixon appeared around the corner of the barn. She had not left. Eleanor was not surprised. The older woman walked across the stubble of the already harvested section with her hands swinging at her sides, and she stopped at the machine and put her ear close to the drive housing and listened to the engine running. Then she reached into the pocket of her flannel shirt and pulled out a small bottle of penetrating oil. "I kept it," she said as explanation. She crouched beside the machine. She applied the oil to 3 specific points with the practiced accuracy of someone who had watched the same process performed many times and had ultimately learned it herself. She wiped the excess with her sleeve. "Give it 2 minutes," she said. Reed looked at the clock. 11:04. Eleanor looked at what remained of the field. How much, she asked Reed, meaning the vouchers. "First load came in at 23:04. Second truck isn't back yet." Eleanor did the arithmetic. The machine had covered perhaps 65% of the field before stopping. She had 47 people picking by hand. In the time remaining, the hand crews could reasonably clear another 10 to 12% of the total acreage. 65 plus 11 was 76%. 76% of 400 acres at this morning's fiber price was going to be close. Very close. The kind of close that does not feel comfortable. She looked at Dottie. 2 minutes, Dottie said again. She was not looking at the clock. It was the longest 2 minutes of Eleanor's morning. She stood by the machine in the October sun, and she did not move, and she did not look at the bank's SUVs, and she did not look at Warren Tisdale, and she did not look at the clock above the barn door. She looked at her field, at the white bolls still on the remaining 35% of the crop, at the men working the edges, at the flat blue sky above the panhandle. She thought about Dale walking this field in the mornings, calling it by its address, Route 60 ground. She thought about her grandfather breaking this soil with a mule. She thought about Bobby. She did not know why she thought about Bobby. He had not been part of the calculation she had been running all morning. But he was there suddenly in her mind, the way things come back, when the mind briefly relaxes its grip on the immediate problem. Bobby at 8, riding on the cotton picker with Dale on a school day they decided not to count. Bobby at 16, angry about something she couldn't even now remember. Bobby at 38, standing at Dale's funeral on the far side of the grave, and they had not spoken that day, not really spoken, and she was not sure why. Not sure whose silence had started it. 2 minutes is not a long time. In most circumstances, 2 minutes is a duration that passes without notice, absorbed into the general flow of a day without leaving a mark. But in the context of 11 o'clock approaching, and a field partially unharvested, and a banker in a black SUV in the driveway with a legal document, 2 minutes acquires a different character. It becomes a specific thing with a beginning and a middle and an end, and each of its 120 seconds is individually felt. Eleanor counted the first 30 of them before she stopped counting because counting was not useful and was taking attention she needed elsewhere. She put her attention on the machine, on the engine note, on the vibration through the floor of the cab, on the specific quality of the stutter in the spindle drive, whether it was getting worse or staying constant, or perhaps if Dottie's oil had gone where it needed to go, beginning to ease. She listened. She had been listening to machines her whole life. Farm machinery, which is complex and old and constantly maintained and constantly breaking, teaches you to listen in a particular way, not just for the presence of a sound, but for its character, its rhythm, its change over time. A sound that stays constant is one kind of problem. A sound that gets worse is another. A sound that eases is information of a different kind entirely. She listened. The stutter was there. It was constant. It was not getting worse. She held that. She let herself hold it without drawing a conclusion. 120 seconds of which approximately 40 remained. "Try it," Dottie said. Eleanor climbed back into the cab. She engaged the drive slowly, feeling for the frequency. The spindle heads moved. Steady. The drive engaged fully. The machine moved forward, and the remaining bowls began to come through the header with the familiar hiss, and Eleanor felt the vibration under her hands, and it was smooth. She drove. The last 35% of the field went in under the October sun, the machine moving steadily, the hand crews working the corners and the edge rows, the relay team running sacks to the collection bin, the gin trucks moving back and forth on Route 60 like a short-course ferry service. At 11:19, Eleanor made the last pass. She came out of the final row and turned onto the field road and stopped the machine and sat in the cab for a moment in the sudden quiet of the engine idling down. The field behind her was stubble and empty stalks. The white gone from it cleared. She looked out through the dusty cab window at 400 acres of harvested ground, and she was aware that her hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the release of something that had been held very tight for a very long time. She climbed down. Dottie Dixon was waiting beside the machine. They looked at each other. There are exchanges between women of a certain age and a certain experience that do not require words, because the words would be inadequate anyway, and both parties understand this. Eleanor put her hand on Dottie's arm for a moment. Dottie covered it with her own. That was enough. Reed Briggs came across the field at a half-run, which was, Eleanor noted, the fastest she had seen him move all morning. He stopped in front of her and held out the vouchers. There were 4 of them now, 4 trips to Fraley's Gin, 4 graded lots, 4 settlement receipts. Eleanor took them. She stood in her harvested field and she added the numbers. She added them again. She looked at Reed. "It's close," she said. "How close?" Eleanor looked at the numbers a third time. She looked at the debt figure in her head. $1,100, she said. "I'm short $1,100. The yard was quiet. Reed looked at the vouchers. He looked at the field. He looked at his men. He pulled his phone out. "Let me make a call," he said. Eleanor put her hand on his arm. "No," she said. He looked at her. "I said I didn't want a transaction," Eleanor said. "I meant it. If I can't clear this debt with my own crop on my own land, then I accept that. She looked at him steadily. But before I accept it, I want to count what's left. I want to count what the hand-picked sacks graded out at. All of it. Reed was quiet for a moment. Then he turned to the man behind him. Where's the last weight ticket from the hand-picked lot? A man Eleanor recognized as the one who had been working the far corner of the north block came forward with the receipt he had been holding. He handed it to Reed. Reed looked at it. He passed it to Eleanor without a word. Eleanor looked at the number. The hand-picked lot, the cotton that 47 men had pulled by hand from the edge rows and the corners in 2 hours under a 10 o'clock October sun, had graded at a premium fiber rating. Dense, clean, low moisture. Fraley's gin had paid the top of market rate. Eleanor added the new number to the total. She stood very still. She added the numbers again, not because she didn't trust the first result, but because a decision like this one deserved to be checked. Dale had always checked his figures twice, had taught her to do the same, because a single check is what you do when you're confident and double-checking is what you do when the stakes are high enough that confidence is not a sufficient substitute for certainty. The numbers were the same the second time as the first. She looked at the total for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, longer than the checking required. She looked at it the way you look at something you have been working toward for a long time, when you first see it in front of you, wanting to hold the moment, wanting to let it be completely real before you move. $54,200. The debt was $52,800. The Route 60 ground had produced $54,200 on this specific October morning, in this specific set of circumstances from the hands of 47 men and 1 woman, and the machine that Dottie Dixon had kept alive. $1,400 left over. "Mr. Briggs?" she said. "Reed." "Reed." She looked up. "I need to go get Warren Tisdale." She walked across the harvested field and across the yard to where the 2 black SUVs were parked, and she was aware of the men watching her from the field and the barn, and the drive 47 iron wolves, and a 71-year-old woman from Hereford and a county sheriff, all of them watching Eleanor McAllister walk across her own ground. Tisdale got out of the SUV when she was 10 feet away. He had his portfolio open again, the foreclosure order in his hand. Behind him, his associate also got out. Both of them had the tight, calibrated expressions of men who had spent the morning in a parked vehicle deciding how they were going to handle this. "Mrs. McAllister," Tisdale said, "it is 11:22. The extended window has—" "I'm aware of the time," Eleanor said. "Come with me." She turned and walked back to the porch. She did not look back to see if he was following. He followed. At the kitchen table, Eleanor sat down and laid out the 4 gin vouchers and the hand-picked lot receipt in a row in front of her. She took a pencil from the cup Dale had kept on the table for as long as she could remember, the ceramic cup with the blue bonnet painted on the side that Bobby had made in 3rd grade art class. She wrote the numbers on the back of the bank's final demand notice. The total was $54,200. The debt with interest and fees was $52,800. The difference was $1,400. Eleanor separated out the bills from the voucher payments, the portion Fraley's had paid in immediate cash, as they always did for the first portion of a settlement, a practice that went back 30 years to when Dale had negotiated it. She counted the bills on the table. She pushed $52,800 across the table toward Warren Tisdale. She kept the remaining $1,400 in front of herself. "That is the full debt," she said. "Principal, interest, penalties, and fees as of today's date. I'd like a written receipt and the release of the lien." Tisdale looked at the money on the table. He looked at the vouchers. He looked at the receipt from the hand-picked lot. He picked up the bank's demand notice with the column of numbers Eleanor had written on the back. He was quiet for a long moment. "The gin tickets are negotiable instruments," he said finally. "The bank will need to—" "Fraley's has been paying out on those tickets for 40 years. Eleanor said. "They'll honor every one of them within 24 hours. You know that as well as I do." She looked at him. "Mr. Tisdale, you came onto this property at 9:17 this morning in violation of the covenant agreement. Sheriff Cross has made a note of that. I have the loan documents and she has her notes. I could contest the service window, which would delay this entire proceeding by at minimum 4 to 6 weeks while the matter is reviewed. She paused. I'm choosing not to do that because I would rather close this debt today and have it done, but that option exists. Tisdale looked at the money. He looked at the door. Outside, through the kitchen window, the yard was visible. The motorcycles. The men. Reed Briggs standing at the barn door with his hands in the pockets of his jeans and his sunglasses on, looking at nothing in particular. Tisdale opened his portfolio and took out a form. He began to write. Eleanor sat at Dale's kitchen table and watched Warren Tisdale from First Continental Bank of Amarillo write out a paid-in-full receipt for the mortgage on a piece of Texas ground that had been in her family for 93 years. She watched him write out the lien release. She watched him sign both documents and date them and turn them to face her. She read them. She looked up. I'll need the originals. These are the originals. Thank you. Eleanor folded them carefully and set them to one side. You can take the money now. Tisdale counted the cash and the vouchers. He put them in his portfolio. He stood up. He was quiet for a moment. Mrs. McAllister, he said. His voice had lost the careful professional flatness. There was something else in it briefly, though he controlled it quickly. I've been doing this for 17 years. I've never seen... He stopped. He started again. You're a remarkable woman. Eleanor looked at him. I'm a farmer, she said. This is my farm. I did what any farmer would do. Tisdale nodded once. He picked up his portfolio. He went out through the front door. Eleanor stayed at the table. She listened to the sound of the SUVs starting turning in the drive, moving up the Caliche to Route 60. She listened until she couldn't hear them anymore. She put her hand flat on the table on the worn oak surface that Dale had refinished in 2001. The ring stains from 30 years of coffee cups, the scratch near the edge where Bobby had dragged his toy trucks when he was 4 years old. She kept her hand there for a moment. Then she picked up the lien release document and held it in both hands and looked at it. The debt is paid in full. The mortgage is satisfied. The property is hereby released from all encumbrances. She set it down carefully. She stood up and went to the back door and opened it. The yard was full of motorcycles and men. The fields behind the barn were empty, the cotton cleared to stubble, the October light falling flat and gold across the harvested ground. 2 of the iron wolves had found the old garden hose at the side of the barn and were washing their hands and arms, talking to each other in low voices. Several others were sitting on their bikes having water from bottles they had found in the cooler. Someone had put the cooler out. Eleanor was not sure when. She had not done it herself. She stood in the doorway and looked at the yard and thought 3 years alone, and today not alone. Not because she had asked for it, because she had done one right thing in the dark and it had come back around. Reed Briggs was standing at the edge of the porch steps. He had his sunglasses pushed up on his head, and he was looking at the harvested fields the same way he had looked at them that morning when they were full of unpicked cotton, with the thorough, unhurried attention of a man who is trying to understand something completely. Eleanor came down the steps and stood beside him and looked at the fields with him. Done, she said. Done, he agreed. They stood there for a moment. How much did you clear over the debt, he said. $1,400. Reed said nothing. But the expression that moved across his scarred face was one she would not forget. It was the expression of a man who is watching the world work out exactly as it should, which is something that does not happen often enough to be taken for granted. Cage came around the side of the barn. He was moving better than he had been in the morning. The limp less pronounced, the set of his shoulders less guarded. He came up to the porch and looked at Eleanor. He's gone, Cage said. He's gone. Cage looked at the fields, at the empty rows. That was the last of it, Eleanor said. Every acre. She paused. Your man Slade, the one who went to Hereford for the part. He was very fast. He's always been very fast, Cage said. We've had different feelings about that over the years. Something in Eleanor's expression eased very slightly. It was not quite a smile. It was the softening that happens in a face that has been held steady under pressure for a long time when the pressure finally goes. Tell him thank you, she said. You can tell him yourself. I intend to. Cage looked at the lien release in her hand. "It's free," he said. Eleanor looked down at the document. "It's free," she said. She stood on her porch with the October sun on her face and the harvested fields before her and the paper in her hand, and she thought about 93 years and 3 generations and a mule and a prayer and a combine and a rebar fulcrum and a woman from Hereford with a bottle of penetrating oil in her shirt pocket, and she thought about Dale walking the Route 60 ground in the early mornings. "Mr. Holden," she said. Cage turned. "Why do they call you Cage?" He was quiet for a moment. "Long story," he said. "I have time," Eleanor said. "I appear to have all the time in the world." He looked at her, and this time the expression on his face was the smile that had not quite formed the night before in the orange light of the burning ditch when she had told him about 8th grade physics. It formed now fully and without reservation. "It's not a flattering story," he said. "I've heard plenty of those," Eleanor said. "Come inside. I'll make coffee." The afternoon was coming on, the light going long and amber across the empty fields, and somewhere north of the barn a mockingbird was running through its whole repertoire, one song after another, the way it does in October when the season is turning. Eleanor McAllister held the door open, and Cage Sergeant-at-Arms of the Iron Wolves, MC Texas Charter, a man who had spent 30 years doing things that were frequently dangerous and occasionally illegal and never dull, walked into the farmhouse kitchen and sat down at the table with the bluebonnet cup and the worn oak surface and 3 years of solitude still hanging in the air. It was not an ending, but it was a breath. And outside in the yard, Reed Briggs looked at the empty field and the empty sky and said something quietly to the man beside him that no one else could hear. The other man looked at the farmhouse. He nodded. There is a kind of debt that gets paid with money, and a kind of debt that gets paid with time and effort, and the willingness to show up at 8:20 in the morning and work until the job is done. The Iron Wolves had come for the first kind and paid the second, and Reed Briggs, who had been in the business of understanding debts for a very long time, understood the difference. He looked at the mockingbird on the fence post. He put his sunglasses back on. He went to see about his men. Inside the kitchen, Cage sat at the table with his hands wrapped around a coffee cup, and Eleanor sat across from him with her own, and for a time they did not talk. The silence in the kitchen was a comfortable silence, the kind that occurs between people who have been through something together and do not feel the need to narrate it. The window above the sink showed the yard outside, the long lines of motorcycles, the men moving between them, with the particular casual ease of people who have finished a hard job and are finding their way back to the ordinary. 2 of them were sitting on the ground in the shade of the barn wall, their boots off their faces turned to the October sun. Another was talking on a phone, pacing a slow circuit of the driveway. Raymond Holden had been called Cage since he was 22 years old, which meant the name was older than a third of the men in the Iron Wolves Texas chapter. He had been given it by a man who was now dead under circumstances he had told only to 2 people in his life, and the telling of it was complicated enough that he had learned to deflect the question with a gesture toward the story's length rather than the story itself. He had been in the Iron Wolves for 26 years. In that time, he had lived in 4 different states, ridden somewhere in the neighborhood of 600,000 miles, buried 7 brothers, attended 32 funerals that were not brothers but were close, survived 1 serious accident before last night, been shot at twice without consequence, and been shot once with a consequence that had required 6 weeks of recovery. He had been present for a number of events that did not appear in any record and would not. He had not in 26 years been pulled out of a burning ditch by a 74-year-old woman using a piece of rebar as a lever. He thought about that as he sat at the kitchen table. He thought about what it said about the world, that such things were possible, that such a woman existed in a farmhouse off Route 60 with her unpicked cotton and her past due notices and her 8th grade physics, and that she had gone out in the dark to do what needed doing without stopping to calculate whether it was practical. He thought about his daughter in Austin and what she would say if he told her this story. She would say, of course. She would say that without surprise. She would say that because she had been raised to believe that people were capable of more than they usually demonstrated, and that the occasions when they demonstrated it were not miracles but simply the situations that required it, meeting the people who rose to meet them. He was going to call her tonight, he decided. He had been meaning to call for 2 weeks. "How long have you been with the Iron Wolves?" Eleanor asked. Cage looked at the window. The late light was catching the chrome of the nearest motorcycle and sending a reflected bar across the kitchen ceiling. 26 years, he said. "That's a long time." "It is." Eleanor turned her coffee cup in her hands. The ceramic was warm against her bandaged palms. She could feel the blistering under the gauze, a clean burn, not deep, the kind that heals in a week if you keep it clean and don't pick at it. "Do you have family?" she said. Cage was quiet for a moment, not an uncomfortable silence. A considered one. "A daughter," he said. "Meredith. She's 29, lives in Austin." "Are you close?" "Getting there." He looked at the table. "We weren't for a long time. I did things that were my fault. She gave me another shot 2 years ago." He paused. "I'm trying to make it worth her while." Eleanor nodded. She understood without being told that this was not a small thing he had just said. "Do you want more coffee?" she said. "Please." She poured. They were quiet again. "My son's name is Bobby," Eleanor said. She had not meant to say it. It came out the way things come out when the guard you've been keeping has been exhausted by a day that was too big for ordinary management. "He's 46. He left when his father was alive and we haven't—" She stopped. "We haven't talked for a while." Cage did not say anything. He did not offer the reflexive sympathy that people offer when they don't know what else to give. He sat with the information the way she had sat with his. "He knew the farm was in trouble," he said finally. "I don't know what he knew," Eleanor said. "I didn't call him." Cage looked at his coffee cup. "You called me to save your father once," he said, "even when you thought he didn't want you to." Eleanor looked at him sharply. "Meredith," he said, 2 years ago, I was in a bad way, one of those situations that don't end well if someone doesn't intervene. She drove 4 hours and showed up at a door I hadn't told her about." He paused. "I hadn't told her a lot of things. She showed up anyway." He looked at Eleanor steadily. "Kids do that," he said, "when they love you, even when you've given them a lot of reasons not to." Eleanor was quiet. Outside, the sound of a truck engine on Route 60, slowing, turning. She looked at the window. A truck she did not recognize was coming down the drive. It was an older model, a dark green Silverado with a dented tailgate, and it was coming slowly the way someone comes who is not sure of their welcome. Eleanor stood up. She went to the window. The truck stopped at the edge of the yard among the motorcycles. The driver's door opened. The man who got out was 46 years old and had his father's height and his mother's pale eyes and a look on his face that Eleanor had not seen since he was very small, since he was the age when people haven't yet learned to arrange their faces to hide what's happening behind them. He stood in the yard among the motorcycles, and he looked at the farmhouse, and he did not come any closer. Eleanor stepped back from the window. She was very still for a moment. Then she went to the back door. She opened it and stood in the doorway. Bobby McAllister looked at his mother standing in the kitchen doorway of the farmhouse where he had grown up, bandages on both hands, dust on her work boots, and something in her face that was not quite what he had expected. He had expected he would tell her later that she would look diminished, that 3 years alone on a failing farm would have worn something out of her. That is what he had feared, and it was one of the reasons he had not come sooner, the fear of what he might see. She did not look diminished. She looked like Eleanor McAllister. "Bobby," she said. He cleared his throat. "I saw it on the news feed, the farm, the bank." He stopped. He looked at the harvested fields, at the motorcycles, at the men. "I drove from Wichita Falls." He looked back at his mother. "I should have come sooner." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," she said, "you should have." And that was it for a moment. Just that. The truth of it sitting between them in the October air, not softened, and not made into something smaller than it was, because Eleanor McAllister did not soft-pedal things, and Bobby had grown up knowing this, and part of what had kept him away was the knowledge that coming back meant being honest about what he had allowed to lapse. But she had opened the door. Bobby came across the yard. He had to navigate between two motorcycles, and as he came past the second one of the Iron Wolves, the young lean-faced one who had been working the north corner, looked at him. The biker looked at the farmhouse. He looked back at Bobby with an expression that was entirely neutral and entirely clear in its meaning, "This is where you need to be." Bobby came up the steps. Eleanor moved back from the doorway to let him in. He stood in the kitchen of his childhood and looked at the table and the coffee cups, and the man sitting at the table who was not his father, and the lien release document folded on the counter, and the blue bonnet cup, which he recognized immediately, because you do not forget the things you made as a child. Cage stood up. "I'll go check on the crew," he said. Eleanor did not stop him. Cage went out through the back door and into the yard. Eleanor and Bobby stood in the kitchen. "Is that—" Bobby looked at the lien release. "Did you—" "The farm is free and clear," Eleanor said, "as of 11:22 this morning." Bobby's face did something complicated. Eleanor watched it. She had 30 years of practice watching that face. "How?" he said. Eleanor looked at the window at the yard outside where Reed Briggs was organizing the loading up of the last collection equipment at Cage, moving through the group of his men at Dottie Dixon, sitting on the tailgate of her Ranger, talking to the young lean-faced biker. "Long story," she said. She pulled out the chair across from the one Cage had been sitting in. "Sit down," she said. "I'll make more coffee." Bobby sat down. He put his hands flat on the table, his father's table, the scarred oak that held 40 years of the family's daily life in its grain. He sat there for a moment, and then he put his face in his hands, and he made one sound, quiet and brief, that was not quite a sob, but was the sound that comes just before a person either cries or manages not to, and he managed not to. Eleanor put the kettle on. She stood at the stove with her back to him and let him have a moment to find himself. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said. "I know," she said. She did not say it was all right, because 3 years of silence is not entirely all right, and both of them knew it, but she said what was true, and that was that she knew, and sometimes that is more important than absolution. The kettle began to heat. Outside, the sound of motorcycles starting up one after another, the deep, percussive chorus of big American engines finding their rhythm. Eleanor turned from the stove and looked out the window. The Iron Wolves were mounting up Reed at the front, moving through the familiar motions of departure. The afternoon sun was behind the house now, casting the yard in shade, the chrome of the motorcycles no longer throwing light, but absorbing it, gleaming dull gold. Cage was the last one on his bike. He was standing beside it, one hand on the handlebars, and he was looking at the kitchen window. Eleanor looked back at him. She did not wave, but she held the look for a moment, and he held it, and it was sufficient. He swung his leg over the bike and kicked it to life. The convoy formed up in the drive with the same disciplined formation in which it had arrived, and Reed Briggs pulled out onto Route 60 and turned south, and 46 motorcycles followed him 2 by 2, the sound building and then diminishing as they moved down the road and around the bend where Route 60 curved past Dead Man's Ditch and headed toward Amarillo. Eleanor stood at the window. Bobby came to stand beside her. They watched until the last of the taillights disappeared around the bend. "Who were they?" Bobby said. He had driven from Wichita Falls, which was 2.5 hours in normal conditions. He had probably made it in less. There was something in the set of his shoulders and the way he had stood at the yard's edge, not moving until she appeared, that told her he had been driving for some time before he arrived, had been working himself up to the turn onto Route 60, had probably slowed at the driveway entrance and sat there for a moment before committing. She had done that once herself years ago, sitting at the entrance of her own driveway after a conversation with Bobby that had ended badly, not wanting to bring whatever it had stirred up into the house with her into Dale's presence, giving herself a minute to set it down. Bobby had inherited that from her apparently, or had arrived at it by his own route, which amounted to the same thing. She looked at her son, and she thought about the ways people carry the same habits into the same situations across generations without ever comparing notes, the way a family line runs through people like a thread through beads, connecting things that seem separate. Eleanor looked at her son, at the pale eyes that were her own eyes and Dale's height, and the particular way he stood with his weight slightly forward like he was about to walk somewhere, which had always been his posture even as a boy. He was here. He was standing in the kitchen of the farm that was free and clear, and he was asking her a question. "Iron Wolves," she said. "They're a motorcycle club, Texas charter." Bobby looked at the empty road. "And they helped you because—" "Because I helped one of theirs," Eleanor said, "when he needed it." Bobby was quiet. "That's all," he said. Eleanor thought about it. About a 1:52 in the morning and dark brown eyes snapping open. About 8th grade physics and a rusted rebar and a concrete culvert. About Cage sitting at this table and saying, "Tell me." About 47 men in a cotton field at sunrise. About Dottie Dixon and the penetrating oil and 18 minutes and 30 years of watching. About a lien release on the counter and $1,400 left over. "That's all," she said. "Somebody needed help and I helped them, and then somebody needed help and they helped me." She looked at the empty road. "That's the whole story." She turned from the window. "The kettle's ready," she said. "You hungry? I was planning to make supper." Bobby looked at her. "Yes," he said, "I'm hungry." Eleanor went to the stove. The kitchen filled with the sound of ordinary things, the kettle's whistle, the drawer opening for the wooden spoon, the particular creak of the cabinet door that Dale had meant to fix for years, and that Eleanor had let stay broken because the sound of it had become part of the house. Bobby sat back down at the table. He picked up the bluebonnet cup. He looked at it for a long moment. He set it down carefully in the center of the table where it had always been. Outside, the October wind moved through the harvested fields. The mockingbird on the fence post ran through its repertoire one more time. The sun went west behind the storm clouds building over New Mexico, and the long light went, and the evening came on the way it always did, the way it had for 93 years, on the Route 60 ground quiet and certain, and without asking anyone's permission. Eleanor McAllister cooked supper. Her farm was free. Her son was home. And somewhere south on Route 6047, motorcycles moved through the Texas evening, heading home, the road running out ahead of them, flat and straight, and lit by a sky full of stars. The first week after the bank left was the quietest Eleanor had known in a long time. Not the quiet of solitude which she had lived with for 3 years, and which had its own texture and weight. This was a different quiet, the quiet of aftermath, the kind that settles over a place where something large has happened, and the ordinary sounds of life are resuming, but everything still carries the echo of the event in it. The wind through the empty cotton rows, the creak of the barn door in the morning, the sound of Bobby's truck in the drive when he came back from town. He had stayed. She had not asked him to. He had gone to his truck the evening of the first day and come back in with a duffel bag, and said if it was all right, he'd sleep in his old room for a while. He had a job that could be done remotely, technical work of some kind, that she did not entirely understand, something involving software systems, which was the sort of work that seemed to Eleanor to happen entirely inside a computer and produce nothing you could hold in your hand, but which clearly provided a living because he had been doing it for 12 years. He sat up on the kitchen table with his laptop and his headphones, and he worked in the mornings and in the afternoons. He walked the farm the way Dale used to walk it, going out after lunch and coming back before supper, sometimes stopping at the old fence line at the south end and standing there for a while. Eleanor watched him do this from the kitchen window. She did not comment on it. There were things between them that had not been said yet. There was a conversation that needed to happen, a real one, about the 8 years of silence and what had built it and what had let it stand so long. Eleanor knew this. She suspected Bobby knew it too, but neither of them initiated it in the first week because there was a natural wisdom to waiting until the ground was steady before you stood on it. In the meantime, there was work. The cotton picker needed a real repair, not Dottie's emergency patch. Eleanor called the John Deere dealer in Amarillo on the Thursday after the harvest and was told a rebuilt spindle drive assembly could be sourced in 3 weeks and installed for $3,200. She had the money from the $1,400 left over from the harvest and a small savings account she had not touched in 2 years, money she had been keeping against exactly this kind of contingency. She made the appointment. 3 weeks later, the John Deere dealer sent a crew out with the rebuilt spindle drive assembly and a service truck, and they spent 6 hours on the cotton picker doing it right, replacing not just the damaged components, but several other parts that had been showing wear, and when they were done, the machine ran the way Eleanor remembered it running when it was new. She sat in the cab and let the engine idle and listened to it. It sounded like itself again. Solid and deep and over-engineered, built to last, built the way things used to be built, when the people who made them assumed that whoever used them would still be using them 30 years later. She ran through the mechanical checks the way she always did, the spindle heads and the cylinder and the drive speeds, each one confirming what her ears had already told her. Everything as it should be. She paid the invoice from the operating account and noted the balance afterward and thought, this is manageable. For the first time in 3 years, the farm's finances were something she could look at straight and describe as manageable. Not comfortable, not generous, but sound. The cotton had been sold. The debt was cleared. The machine was repaired. The winter wheat was in the ground in the south block, which Bobby had helped her plant on a cold, clear November morning, working the rows together in the particular companionable silence of people doing work they both know how to do. Dale would have been pleased about the south block. He had talked about diversifying into winter wheat for a decade and had never gotten to it, partly because of the machine cost and partly because there was always something more pressing. The something more pressing had finally cleared. She climbed down from the cab and walked to the barn door and stood there, looking at the harvested fields in the November light. The ground was bare and dark and quiet, holding whatever it held against the spring. She could smell faintly the difference in the soil where the wheat had gone in the opened earth smell of ground that has been worked recently. She thought sometimes about what Sheriff Lena Cross had said when Eleanor called her the following week to thank her for coming out that morning. Lena had been quiet for a moment before responding, the particular quiet that precedes a thought that has been considered before being spoken. "Eleanor," she said, "I've been doing this job for 28 years. I've seen foreclosures. I've seen families lose things they built over generations. I've been there when the papers got served, and I've watched people walk off land their grandparents broke, and I have never found a way to feel all right about it." A pause. "That morning was the first time in 28 years I drove away from one of those situations, feeling like the right thing had happened." Eleanor had thought about that for a long time afterward. The right thing had happened, not through any official process, not through the legal mechanisms that were supposed to exist for situations like hers, and frequently did not through institutional intervention of any kind. Through a man on a motorcycle going too fast on a road he didn't know well enough at 2 a.m, and a piece of rusted rebar, and a woman from Hereford with 30 years of knowledge in her hands. The right thing was not always where you expected to find it. Sometimes it was in the ditch. She thought about that too. The ditch. Dead Man's Ditch, which had a proper name she had never used and probably never would. She had looked at that ditch from her field road for 40 years without thinking much about it beyond the practical drainage capacity, the way it handled the spring runoff. She would never look at it the same way again. Some places become larger than their geography through what happens in them. The ditch was larger now. Dale would have found this entire sequence of events enormously satisfying, she thought again. The rightness of it would have pleased him, the way unexpected but deserved outcomes always pleased him, because he had believed all his life that the universe was broadly fair if you gave it enough time and engaged with it in good faith. Eleanor had been less certain of this than he was. She was still less certain, but she was on balance more willing to consider the possibility than she had been on the night of October 13th, sitting at the kitchen table with the lights off and the past due notices in front of her. That was something. She thought about her grandfather planting sorghum on this same ground in 1931 with a borrowed mule and a bought second-hand plow in the first autumn of the Depression, because planting was what you did when the ground was yours and the season was right regardless of what else was happening in the world. The South Block looked different with wheat in it. Bobby noticed it first. He came in from the afternoon walk and said that the South Block looked different, and Eleanor, who had been watching it from the kitchen window all week, said yes, it does, and they stood at the window together for a moment and looked at it. The winter wheat had come up thin, and even in the rose pale green against the dark soil, the color of something starting rather than something ending. Dale would have gone out and walked those rows the same evening they showed green. He would have crouched down at the edge of the first row and looked at the emergence with the attention of a man seeing evidence of his intention made real. He would have said something about it, some observation about the stand count, or the soil temperature, or the way the light was hitting it, and Eleanor would have listened and watched and understood and added her own note to his. She thought about going out and crouching down at the edge of the row herself. She put on her boots. Bobby came out behind her without being asked. They walked the South Block in the late afternoon light, moving slowly down the row, checking the emergence, and Bobby asked questions that were the right questions, specific and practical about soil preparation and seed rate and the expected harvest window. He had grown up on this farm. He knew what mattered to know. The knowledge had been there all along under the 8 years of silence and distance intact. She answered everything he asked. They walked back to the house in the long evening light with the wheat behind them and the empty cotton fields to the east and the October stars beginning in the west. And Eleanor thought about generations, about the way a family's understanding of a specific piece of ground accumulates over time and cannot be replaced by anything else. You can hire someone to work the land, but you cannot hire someone to know it. Bobby knew it. He had always known it. He had learned it in the same way she had learned it growing up on it, walking it, listening to the people who had worked it before him talk about what it held and what it needed and what it gave in return. That knowledge did not go away just because you left. It was still there. She went inside to make coffee. She called Dottie Dixon on the same Thursday. Dottie answered on the second ring. "I've been wondering when you'd call," Dottie said, which was the way that women of a certain generation have of saying they expected the call and were waiting for it, and that there is nothing in the slightest wrong with the timing. "I wanted to wait until I knew what I was calling to say," Eleanor said. "Fair enough. What are you calling to say?" Eleanor looked at the lien release document which she had framed. Not with any sentiment. She was not a sentimental woman. But a document of that significance she felt deserved to be in something other than the kitchen filing box, and the hardware store in town sold simple frames, and she had put the document in one and hung it on the wall beside the door to the hall, where Dale had always hung the farm's operating license and the inspection certificates for the equipment. It looked appropriate there in her estimation. "I'm calling to say thank you," Eleanor said, "for the part, for the repair, for staying." "I didn't stay because of you," Dottie said, which was a complicated thing to say, but which Eleanor understood immediately, because it was the kind of statement that seems contrary, but is actually the deepest form of connection. "I didn't do it for you. I did it because it was the right thing to do. And the fact that it also helped you is something I'm glad of, but it was never the condition." "I know," Eleanor said. "George would have done it faster," Dottie said. "He knew that machine like he knew his own hands. The 9970 was his favorite to work on. He said John Deere built it the way things used to be built, over-engineered, meant to last." "It lasted 33 years, Eleanor said. "And counting," Dottie said. A pause, the comfortable kind. "I'd like to have you to dinner sometime," Eleanor said. "If you'd like to come." "I'd like that," Dottie said. "I eat early." "So do I," Eleanor said. She called Cage on a Saturday, 10 days after the harvest. He answered on the fourth ring, his voice carrying road noise in the background. He was writing. Mrs. McAllister. Eleanor, we've been through too much for Mrs. McAllister. A beat. Eleanor. How's your leg? Functional. The head's clearing up. The doctor in Amarillo said the concussion was mild. A pause. He also said, whoever stitched the cut on my forehead in the field had good technique. The EMTs did that. I know, but somebody held the compress for 40 minutes before the EMTs got there. Eleanor did not reply to that. How's the farm? Cage said. Free and clear, Eleanor said. My son is here. The road noise on the line continued for a moment. She could picture him, the big machine, moving through the Texas landscape, the October countryside, going past the flat horizon and the wide sky that went on forever in the panhandle. That's good, he said. It is, she agreed. I wanted to ask you something. Ask. The other day, you told me about Meredith, Eleanor said. About her driving 4 hours to a door you hadn't told her about. You said you were trying to make it worth her while. I did say that. Is it working? A longer pause. The road noise. I think so, he said. I'm going to see her next week. Austin. She wants to show me where she lives. Good, Eleanor said. That's important, seeing where someone lives. Yes, Cage said. I think you're right. I usually am, Eleanor said. It's one of the things that makes me difficult to live with. My late husband told me so on many occasions. The sound that came through the phone was not quite a laugh, but was the warm precursor to one. I should let you ride, Eleanor said, but I wanted to call, to say thank you properly, not in the middle of everything. You don't owe me thanks, Cage said. I know I don't owe it, Eleanor said. I'm giving it anyway because it's what I want to do. There's a difference. A pause. All right, he said. You're welcome. And tell Reed Briggs the same, and Slade, who was very fast, and the man who worked the north corner all morning and didn't stop. That's Duke, Cage said. Duke Roth. He doesn't stop. It's a thing about him. Tell him, Eleanor said. I will. She hung up the phone and stood in the kitchen for a moment, and then she went out to see how Bobby was getting on with the south fence line, which needed new wire in 2 places, and which she had been putting off for longer than was advisable. The conversation with Bobby came in mid-November. It came the way conversations like that usually come, not by appointment, not when either party is ready for it, but in the middle of something ordinary. They were in the barn, replacing a section of gate hardware, and Bobby was holding the post, while Eleanor drove the bolts with the impact driver, and he said without preamble, I should have come when Dad died. Eleanor set the impact driver down. She looked at him. He was looking at the gate post he was holding, not at her, the way people look at the nearest solid object when they are saying something they have been carrying for a long time. You were there, Eleanor said. At the funeral. I was there for 3 days. Then I left. He shifted his grip on the post. I didn't come back to help you wind things down. I didn't come back to help you figure out the farm finances. I left you alone with all of it. Eleanor was quiet. Why? She said, not as an accusation, as a genuine question. Bobby looked up. His pale eyes were his mother's eyes. Because it was too hard, he said. Being here, this place, everything in it is him. Every room, every tool, every field. He paused. I thought if I stayed, I'd have to feel all of it at once, and I didn't know if I could. He stopped again. That was a coward's reason. It was a human reason, Eleanor said. It was still wrong. Yes, Eleanor picked up the impact driver. She looked at the bolt she still needed to drive. I won't say it was fine, she said. It wasn't fine. 3 years is a long time to be alone with something this size. She paused. But you're here now. That's what I care about. I should have come sooner. You should have, Eleanor agreed. And you didn't. And now you're here. That's what we have to work with. She drove the bolt. The gate hardware seated properly, and she stepped back to look at it the way Dale would have looked at it, checking the alignment, the clearance at the bottom, the way it swung. It'll hold, she said. She wasn't only talking about the gate. Bobby knew that. He nodded. They walked back to the house together across the bare stubble fields, their boots leaving tracks in the soft November ground, and the afternoon sun was low and gold behind them, and their shadows went long before them across the harvested rows and the mockingbird was somewhere off to the north, doing its November repertoire, and the windmill was turning in the light west wind, and the farmhouse was ahead of them on the rise. Neither of them said anything, but the silence between them had changed. It was not the silence of distance anymore. It was the silence of two people who know each other and are walking in the same direction, and who have said what needed to be said, and who are willing to put one foot in front of the other and continue. Eleanor McAllister had lived on this land for 50 years. She had seen good harvests and terrible ones. She had seen a price crash in 1985 that had nearly taken the farm before, and had been managed by her and Dale together, two young people who were not yet sure of themselves, but were sure of each other. She had seen 3 droughts, 1 flood, and the year the boll weevil came back and took a third of the crop before anyone knew what was happening. She had raised a son and buried a husband and spent 3 years learning what it meant to be entirely responsible for something that was larger than herself. She had never in all of that asked for help she did not have to ask for, but there was something she had come to understand in the 10 days since the harvest, sitting with the lien release on the wall and the farm's accounts finally in the black, and her son at the kitchen table in the mornings, and the knowledge that the cotton picker would be properly repaired in 3 weeks, that the help she had received on the morning of October 14th had not been charity. It had not been a gift. It had been the consequence of an action she had taken without calculation or expectation in a drainage ditch at 1:40 in the morning because a man was there and he needed pulling out. That was the whole of it. You did the right thing because it was the right thing to do. You pulled the person out of the fire because they needed pulling out. You stood with your hand on the compress for 40 minutes in the cold dark because that was what the situation required. And the world, which is full of debts and obligations and the complicated mathematics of who owes what to whom, sometimes, not always, not often enough, but sometimes balances the account in ways you did not arrange and could not have predicted. The iron wolves of the Texas Charter had come down Route 60 in the morning with no guarantee that the farm could be saved. They had come because Cage had called Reed and Reed had made the call, and they had come because their code said, "You show up when one of yours has been helped." That code was a hard one, earned in hard places, and Eleanor had seen it operate from the inside now, and she would not romanticize it. These were complicated men who lived by rules that were not always the world's rules, who had done things she probably preferred not to know about, who would continue to do things she probably preferred not to know about. But they had come, and they had worked until the job was done. And when it was done, they had gone without asking for anything except the acknowledgement of a debt paid and a handshake from a woman who had not hesitated in a ditch at 1:40 in the morning. Eleanor thought about this as she and Bobby walked back to the farmhouse in the November afternoon. She thought about what Dale would have said about it. Dale, who had walked this ground for 40 years and talked to it like it was a living thing. Dale, who had never been quick to judge people, and who had always said that the most interesting thing about a person was usually the thing they didn't tell you first. She thought he would have liked Cage. She thought he would have liked Reed Briggs, though the two of them might have had a complicated few hours getting to that point. She thought he would have immediately and completely liked Dottie Dixon. She thought he would have liked this story, the whole unlikely, improbable, true-hearted machinery of it, a crashed motorcycle and a rebar lever, and a 71-year-old woman with penetrating oil in her shirt pocket, and 47 men in a cotton field and a banker's face when the numbers came out right. He would have laughed about it for years. Eleanor smiled at the thought. Bobby looked at her. "What?" "Nothing," she said. "I was thinking about your father." Bobby was quiet. "He would have liked this story," Eleanor said. Bobby looked at the fields, at the farmhouse, at the weather vane on the barn roof turning in the wind. "Yeah," he said. "He would have." They went inside. At the table, Bobby made coffee because he had learned in the past 2 weeks that making the coffee was one of the things you could do, one of the ways you could be useful in a kitchen that had been managed for 3 years by a woman who had very specific ideas about how things were done and who was not going to surrender those ideas on her son's behalf, but who would accept gratefully the making of coffee. Eleanor sat at the table. She looked at the lean release in its frame on the wall. She thought 93 years. Her grandfather with his mule, her father paying off the mortgage, her and Dale for 4 decades, the breaking drought years and the good years, the broken machine and the bank's SUV in the drive, and the ground vibrating under her feet at 8:20 in the morning and the sound of 47 engines cutting out in unison. She thought 10 generations could live here if they chose to. The ground would hold them. The Route 60 ground. It had held everyone so far. Bobby set a coffee cup in front of her, the bluebonnet cup. She picked it up and held it. She thought about how small this was. This kitchen, this table, this cup made in a 3rd-grade art class. She thought about how large it was at the same time, how everything important is simultaneously small and large. She thought about Cage on a highway in Central Texas, riding toward Austin to see where his daughter lived. She thought about Dottie Dixon driving home to Hereford with a bottle of penetrating oil back in her shirt pocket and 40 years of her husband's expertise in her hands. She thought about Reed Briggs looking at the empty field with his sunglasses on. She thought about one moment, the moment she had stood in the barn cab with her hand on the key and said, "Lord, I could use a hand," and turned the ignition and heard the engine find its compression and watched the spindle heads come out. That moment she thought was going to last her a long time. Bobby sat across from her and looked at the framed document on the wall. "What happens now?" he said. Eleanor considered the question. It was a good question. It was in some ways the only question. What happens now after the crisis has passed, when the extraordinary day is over and the ordinary days resume? What do you do with the farm, with the machines, with the accounts, with the relationship between a mother and a son that has been absent for 8 years and has now been given a chance, tentative and cautious and real, to be something again? Now, Eleanor said, we repair the cotton picker properly. We plant winter wheat in the south block, which Dale always wanted to do and never got to. We fix the south fence properly, not patch it. We have Dottie Dixon to dinner before it gets too cold to make the drive comfortable. She paused. And we talk. Bobby looked at his coffee cup. About what? About everything, Eleanor said. There's a lot of it. We have time. He looked at her. There was something in his face in that moment that she recognized. It was the face he had worn as a small boy, when something difficult had resolved into something clear, when the anxiety of the unresolved situation gave way to the simpler, steadier feeling of understanding what needed to happen next. It was his father's face, underneath the bones of it, and she was glad it was there, the evidence of Dale still present and visible in their son. Okay, Bobby said. Okay, Eleanor agreed. Outside, the November wind moved through the empty cotton rows, rattling the dry stalks. The windmill on the barn turned steadily. The hawk that had been working the east field all afternoon made one final pass and went east, following the last of the day's thermals. The Route 60 ground lay still and dark under the cold sky, waiting as it had always waited for the next season, for whatever came next. Eleanor McAllister picked up her coffee cup and held it in both bandaged hands and looked out the window at the farm that was hers, fully and legally and without qualification, hers free of every debt, and she thought, this is what it feels like. This, a kitchen table and a cup and a son across from her, and a long overdue conversation beginning to take shape in the air between them and the framed lean release on the wall, and the sound of the wind and the October stars coming on one by one in the darkening Texas sky. This is what it feels like when a thing you were afraid of losing turns out to be something you still have. And maybe that's the whole story. Maybe that's all any story is in the end. The thing you thought you'd lost returning to you in a form you didn't expect at a time you couldn't have planned for because of a decision you made at 1:40 in the morning, when you could have stayed inside and locked the door and let the situation be someone else's problem. Eleanor McAllister had not locked the door. She had been thinking about this for several weeks, turning it over the way she turned over any problem that interested her, looking at it from different angles. She had come to several conclusions, and she was not sure all of them were right, but she was sure that they were the conclusions she could honestly arrive at from where she stood. The first was that kindness in the dark, kindness without an audience and without expectation of return, was the rarest and most fundamental form of it. Anyone could be kind when it was easy, when someone was watching, when the act would be noted and appreciated. The test was whether you did it when none of those conditions were present, when you were alone and tired and had your own troubles, and there was no reward available, and no one would ever know if you looked away. She had not looked away. She did not think of herself as particularly virtuous for that. She thought of it as a decision she had made and that she would make again under the same circumstances. That was what decisions were for. You made them when the situation presented itself, and you did not unmake them afterward because they had turned out to be harder than expected. The second conclusion was that she had been lucky. Not in the sense that luck was random, but in the sense that the world contains more good in it than is visible on an average day, and that sometimes the circumstances align to make that good visible, and that when that happens, the right response is not to explain it away or find the rational structure behind it that makes it ordinary, but simply to receive it and let it be what it is. There was, she had decided, no adequate word for what the iron wolves had done that morning. Not kindness, which was too small. Not heroism, which was too large and too self-conscious. Not charity, which they themselves had specifically rejected. The closest she could come was the word that had been in use in small communities since long before the modern world gave it complicated implications: neighborliness. The willingness to treat the person next to you as someone whose need is a legitimate call on your attention and effort simply because they are there and the need is real. She and the iron wolves of the Texas Charter had never been neighbors before that morning. They might never be neighbors again in any practical sense, their lives running in parallel lines with no reason to intersect. But on October 14th, in the specific way that the word meant its oldest and best thing they had been, she was glad of it. She was glad for all of it, for the darkness and the fire and the rebar and the 47 men and the 30 years of knowledge in Dottie Dixon's hands and the Section 7 Paragraph B she had read carefully, because that was how she read everything. She was glad she had gone out with the flashlight. She had taken the flashlight and gone out into the dark alone and unasked because it was the right thing to do and there was no one else. And the rest had followed from that. All of it. Every last acre of it. The rest had followed from that. 3 weeks later, the John Deere dealer sent a crew out with the rebuilt spindle drive assembly and a service truck, and they spent 6 hours on the cotton picker doing it right, replacing not just the damaged components, but several other parts that had been showing wear, and when they were done, the machine ran the way Eleanor remembered it running when it was new. She sat in the cab and let the engine idle and listened to it. It sounded like itself again. Solid and deep and over-engineered, built to last, built the way things used to be built when the people who made them assumed that whoever used them would still be using them 30 years later. Dale would have been pleased. She paid the invoice from the operating account and noted the balance afterward, and thought, this is manageable. For the first time in 3 years, the farm's finances were something she could look at straight and describe as manageable. Not comfortable, not generous, but sound. The cotton had been sold, the debt was cleared, the machine was repaired. The winter wheat was in the ground in the south block, which Bobby had helped her plant on a cold, clear November morning, working the rows together, neither of them talking much, but both of them doing the work, and the work had been good. Dottie Dixon came for dinner on a Friday in mid-November. She drove her Ranger up from Hereford in the early afternoon and came in through the kitchen door, which is the way people who know a farmhouse enter it, through the working door, and not the front door, which is a distinction that matters more than it sounds. She brought a pie, a blackberry pie with a lattice crust, and she set it on the counter and looked around the kitchen with the contained attention of a woman who is reading a room. George Dixon had worked farms across the Texas Panhandle for 30 years, and Eleanor had thought about him sometimes over those 3 decades, the way you think about people whose paths crossed yours briefly and left something behind. He had come to the farm in the spring of 1998 to do the cotton picker's first major service, a 2-day job that had turned into 3 when he found something in the hydraulic system that needed additional attention. He had eaten lunch at this same table both days, and he and Dale had talked in the way that men who share a practical fluency talk, with the specificity and the mutual respect of people who know what they're discussing. Eleanor had listened the way she always listened when the conversation was worth following. She had not expected to be sitting at this table with his wife 26 years later. She had not expected the shape that the debt and the gratitude and the October morning would take. But she had learned over a long life that expectation was frequently the wrong frame for understanding what happened. What happened was what happened. You could prepare for it as best you could, and then you received it as it came. The blackberry pie was extraordinary. "This is a good kitchen," she said. "My husband built the cabinets," Eleanor said. Dottie touched the edge of one cabinet door. She looked at the grain of the wood, the quality of the joints. "He was a careful man." "He was," Eleanor said, "very." Bobby came in from outside, and Eleanor introduced them, and the 3 of them sat at the table and talked through the late afternoon and into the evening, and the conversation went from the farm to the harvest, to George Dixon's life and work, to Dale's life and work, to the wider question of how people build the things they build and why. And it was the kind of conversation that happens between people who have lived long enough to know what is worth talking about, and who have found themselves in unexpected proximity to each other and are making good use of it. After dinner, when Bobby had gone to do the evening check on the barn, and it was just the 2 of them in the kitchen, Dottie looked at the lean release in its frame. "George would have liked what happened here," she said. "I know," Eleanor said. "I've thought that." "He always said this was good land." Dottie paused. "He worked a lot of farms in this county. He said this was the one he'd have wanted if things had been different." She looked at Eleanor. "He meant it as a compliment." "I take it as one," Eleanor said. Dottie stayed until 9, which is late for women who rise early and drive 40 miles home in the dark. Eleanor walked her out to the Ranger. The sky was enormous and full of stars, the way it is in the Panhandle on clear nights, when there are no clouds and no competing lights, and the cold air carried the smell of plowed ground from the South Block, where the winter wheat was finding its depth in the soil. "Same time next month," Dottie said. "I'll make the pie," Eleanor said. Dottie got in the Ranger and backed down the drive and turned onto Route 60 and went south toward Hereford, her tail lights small and red in the flat Texas dark. Eleanor stood in her drive for a moment and looked at the sky. She was not sentimental about most things, but she was. She had found a woman who stood in her drive at night and looked at the stars and let herself feel the full weight and the full fortune of being precisely where she was, on this land, under this sky, in this particular arrangement of circumstances that had brought her to this moment and no other. She thought about the morning of October 14th. She thought about all of the things that had to happen in exactly the order they happened for the day to come out the way it did. A motorcycle at a dangerous speed on a road with no guardrail, a rebar half buried in concrete, 8 miles to a cotton gin, a 71-year-old woman who wouldn't stay home, a Section 7 paragraph B in a loan agreement, a banker who left before the deadline he should have honored. Any one of those things changed, and the day comes out differently. But they happened as they happened, and the day came out as it did, and here she was standing in the drive of a farm that was free and clear, looking at the Texas stars. She went inside. Bobby was at the table with his laptop, working on something in the quiet way he worked, absorbed and efficient. He looked up when she came in. "Good dinner," he said. "She's good company," Eleanor said. She took the kettle off the back burner and checked the water level and put it on the front. She moved around the kitchen, doing the small end-of-evening tasks, putting away the last of the dishes, wiping the counter, moving the pie plate to the refrigerator. Ordinary things done in a kitchen at night with someone else in the room. She had missed this. She had not let herself know how much she had missed it until it came back, the simple weight of another person in the house, the small sounds of shared space. "Bobby," she said. He looked up from the laptop. "I'm glad you're here," she said. She said it plainly because she was a plain-spoken woman, and sentiment came out wrong in her if she tried to dress it up. He looked at her. She put the kettle on and sat down at the table, and they sat together in the kitchen. Light the Texas wind moving around the edges of the house, the winter wheat in the ground to the south, the cotton picker repaired in the barn. Outside, the Route 60 ground was quiet under the November dark. In a bar in Amarillo, two iron wolves were having a beer and not talking much, the way men who have ridden together for a long time often occupy space together, present and comfortable and not requiring anything in particular from each other. In Hereford, Dottie Dixon turned into her drive and parked the Ranger and went inside and turned on the kitchen light in a house that had been quieter than it should have been for 2 years, and she looked at the tools on the wall, George's tools hanging where he had always hung them. She touched the handle of the 3/4-inch impact driver. She went to make herself some tea. In Austin, Cage sat on the porch of his daughter's apartment while she was inside making dinner, and he looked at the street below, the evening traffic, the lights coming on in the windows of the buildings, the city going about its ordinary business. He had been here 3 days. He was staying another 2. Meredith came to the door and said dinner was ready. He went inside, and on a highway in West Texas, moving through the dark, Reed Briggs rode alone the way he sometimes rode when he needed to think, the road running straight ahead into the black distance, the stars overhead, the flat land going by on either side. He was not thinking about anything in particular. He was riding. He was moving through the world at speed the way he had moved through it for 30 years, the road doing what roads do for riders who have been at it long enough, cleaning the mind, clarifying the essential, reducing everything to the single important fact of motion and direction, and the next mile. He thought briefly about an old farmhouse and a woman standing on the porch steps with her hands at her sides who had not gone inside when 47 motorcycles came down her drive. He thought about that for a moment. Then he opened the throttle and the engine went deep, and the road came up faster and the stars wheeled overhead, and he rode into the dark southwest toward home. Some things do not need to be said to be understood. Some debts do not come with paperwork. Some nights in the Texas Panhandle the wind is very still and the stars are very close, and the Route 60 ground lies quiet under them, holding everything it holds: 3 generations of a family, 40 years of a marriage, the memory of a man who built good cabinets and walked his fields in the mornings and called them by name, and a new season coming always, the winter wheat in the ground, the cotton picker in the barn repaired and ready, Eleanor McAllister at her kitchen table, her son across from her, the lean release on the wall. This is what it looks like when things come right. This is what it looks like when someone faced with a burning ditch in the middle of the night does not choose the easy thing. She went out with the flashlight, and the rest followed from that.